particular, feel free to tweet about it as well. So the title of today's panel is What Kind of Growth Do We Need? And I just want to give you a bit of context before we launch into the discussion. One pillar or guiding principle of this special meeting is how to foster inclusive growth. So there are 3 pillars. One of them is how do we encourage inclusive growth? Now, the World Economic Forum back in Davos launched an initiative, the Future of Growth Initiative, on how to incorporate other factors into a country's growth profile. So not just what you typically look at to analyze how a country is doing economically, but also including other factors like the country's ability to innovate, be sustainable, be inclusive, and be resilient. So I'm happy to say that Sadia Zahidi, who I think is in the room somewhere, the managing director from WEF, is going to tell us more about this initiative right at the end of our discussion today. So we're going to pencil in just a couple of minutes to go over this Future of Growth initiative. But for now, we're going to start off our discussion. And as I said, the focus is going to be about growth. So we're going to do a couple of rounds. The first round, we're going to talk about how things are looking right now. What are the drivers of growth? How do we feel? Of course, managing director just back from the spring meetings. What are some of the near-term sensitivities to watch out for? And then we're going to launch into a discussion about the evaluation of the medium-term trajectory, a further analysis on the composition of the type of growth that we want to see. And so if there's one takeaway from this panel for everybody watching, the focus that we want to see is not just on the quantity of growth, but on the quality of growth. What type of growth do we want to see in the future? Right, I'm going to introduce the panelists now. No introduction needed. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF. Thank you very much. His Excellency, Mohammed Al-Jadaan, the Minister of Finance from Saudi Arabia, and thank you very much for hosting us. And we have Tengku Zafrul bin Tengku Abdul Aziz, the Minister of Trade, Investment and Authority in Malaysia. Very good welcome to you. Managing Director, I'm gonna start with you because I did mention that you're coming back from these spring meetings in the IMF, in DC rather, and it's always an interesting time to assess and take a look at how people are feeling about things. The IMF published the World Economic Outlook, and one of the lines that struck me from the report is that you say growth actually has been resilient despite many shocks. So let's just start with that. How do you see things, and what do you think are the biggest growth drivers right now?
Let me start by congratulating Minister Al-Jadaan for taking over the responsibility to chair the committee of the IMF, the IMFC. That was his first meeting in the chair, and may I say he was brilliant. Substantively, we had great discussions, and every single meeting ended on the dot. Doesn't happen often. During these meetings, there were 2 big messages coming from the IMF. The first one is that growth has been resilient, the economies have been resilient despite the multiple shocks we were hit over the last years. We slightly upgraded our growth projection for 2024. Now it is 3.2%. In October last year, it was 2.9%. We also recognize that the strength, the resilience of this projection comes from a small number of countries that are doing really well. The United States is one, some of the emerging market economies like India, Indonesia add to that. But the second big message from the meetings is that the divergence within country blocks and across country blocks and within countries is deepening. What we have is, in advanced economies, the United States is doing well, but the Eurozone is not. Within the emerging market economies, I mentioned India, Indonesia, actually I look at Malaysia. These are countries that are doing well. China came a bit above expectations in its first quarter, but then we have a number of countries that are facing significant difficulties. Just to mention some, like Pakistan. Egypt is doing now better, but Egypt is also faced with difficult environment. And then we have the toughest part of all, low-income countries falling dramatically behind. I want to give you a number, $3.3 trillion. This is how much the world lost because of the pandemic. In this loss, disproportionately, the low-income countries are most severely impacted. So when we look at the immediate priorities, there are three. One, get inflation in countries where it is still above target, down to target. Yes, we have achieved a lot in the fight against inflation. It is going down, down, but not yet gone. Second, focus on rebuilding fiscal buffers. What has happened over the last years is countries used all the ammunition they had because of COVID, then the war in Ukraine, then the cost of living crisis. But more shocks will come, and rebuilding fiscal buffers is a priority, yet tough when countries are also faced with the need to support the digital transformation, the green transformation, and to help vulnerable people. And three, let's find ways to cooperate more. Because fragmentation in the world economy is certainly bad for the prospects for growth.
We're going to talk more about that. There's one thing that I want to pick up on, though. You say inflation, and whenever anyone says inflation, I have a bell in my head that says interest rates. And I do want to ask you about that just before we move on, because we're talking about current global growth drivers. A couple of months ago, I think the world was expecting the Fed, the US Central Bank, to go for as many as 5-6 cuts this year. The market has moved firmly away from that, pricing in maybe only just one cut by the end of this year. To what extent do you think these tighter financial conditions, these tighter monetary conditions, are going to affect growth? Our panel is about growth. Not just US growth, but of course, tighter financial conditions around the world are going to affect emerging markets too.
It is a very significant factor. It is a factor because when you have high interest rates, then getting this rebuilding of buffers becomes even harder. And we see higher interest rates genuinely impacting negatively growth prospects around the world. Second, higher interest rates in the United States mean that money goes there. Why take risks in emerging markets when you can put your money in US treasuries or just invest in US? Three, higher interest rates means also strong dollar. And when the dollar is strong, the flip side is for many currencies, that means currency depreciation. And that makes domestically fighting inflation more difficult. So for the US, the path towards cutting interest rates, in our view, in the view of the IMF, still remains open. We still think that we would enter 2025 in the US with inflation finally down to target and interest rates finally moving towards lower levels. But let me say it as clearly as I can. Even with the start of interest rate cuts, it doesn't mean interest rates would fall down to where they were before the pandemic. So strong fiscal position, good management in all countries is a necessity.
Okay, great. Well, there's lots to pick up on from there. Your Excellency, maybe let me just...
I thought we agreed you will ask them.
Maybe I'm going to give you an open question just to start. I know you put together the budget for Saudi Arabia back in December, and you had your assessment of how you thought the growth outlook was going to pan out this year. We're a couple of months in. The IMF are saying that growth has been relatively resilient despite the shocks, but of course, beneath the surface, we're seeing some divergence. How do you see things versus where we were a few months ago?
First of all, thank you very much for being here, and hopefully this will not be the last visit. So
definitely not.
And thank you, Kristalina, for being here also, and Mr. Aziz. Few things. I think globally, as we have heard from Kristalina, there are significant divergences. There are countries who are doing very well, and there are countries who are really struggling, and there are countries in between. And therefore, if we are talking globally, we need to take that into consideration, that there are differences in positions between different countries and different regions. Second, I think the world for the last 4 years have seen multiple shocks. And those like us who had planned for the longer term will need to be agile enough to make sure that they adjust course, dealing with these multiple shocks. So you need to make sure that you are not rigid. And I've always said in economic planning, there is no egos. So it's okay to change, it's okay to adjust, it's okay to reflect on what new circumstances that calls for changes. And that, to me, is an advice that I would give everyone around the world, is that you need to make sure that, yes, you need the long-term plans, you need the vision, like Vision 2030. It is actually very helpful, not only for you as a government, but for the whole economy, and for the wider even region and international investor community to see that actually you have a plan and you are doubling down on implementation. But also you need to make sure that you adjust. So with inflation, with COVID and the serious supply chain disruption, and then inflation resulting from the serious also quantitative easing that happened as a result of COVID, and then interest rate hikes, and then geopolitical tensions, which are unfortunately increasing rather than decreasing. To me, geopolitical risks are possibly the #1 risks if you look at the global economy at large. Because it's not only the geopolitical in its own. The geopolitical tensions brings with it things that are directly impacting the economies, which is fragmentation, protectionism, using economy as a serious tool to achieve geopolitical objectives in terms of limitations in trade, limitations in technology, etc. So these will need to be looked at, and policymakers will need to be very agile in dealing with this. My advice, and I will be very brief, is one is in the longer term, regardless of what's happening today, because we have seen geopolitics happening for decades. We have seen World War I and World War II and Cold War. And so you need to focus, first of all, on your own people and the human capital development. This is a long-term play that is critical. Human capital is very, very critical. Unfortunately, I can say this and possibly have the means to do it in Saudi and in this region, but there are a lot of countries who will find it very difficult to provide quality education, quality health care to their people. Second, which is very important, and I'll cover also the low-income country part of it, is innovation and technology. If there is one tool that will actually fuel growth, quality growth, would be innovation and technology. Again, there are countries who will be able actually to do that, provide the policies, and have the resources to actually implement innovation and technology. There are other countries who doesn't have basic electricities for most of their population. So you will not talk about technology, you will not talk about innovation, just provide them the basics. That said, multilateral institutions have a role to play in here, i.e. not leaving these countries behind, making sure that we provide the support. And in Saudi Arabia, I can tell you, our contribution in terms of aid and support is significantly more than our GDP percentage out of the global GDP. And that is very, very critical, really, to look at in the global scene. Finally, and I think this is very important and something that is dear to my heart, we've been talking about it at the IMF, is debt sustainability.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
You cannot expect people to focus on growth when they are really crushed with debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And there are countries who are finding it very difficult, actually, to provide the basics to their people because of the debt. So we need to make sure that we help. The common framework that started during our presidency of the G20 is moving in the right direction. We need to make sure that it moves a lot faster. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, the last time you and I were on a panel, it was also a panel about debt sustainability and debt reform. I do just want to follow up and talk about specifically the geopolitical tensions within the region. The war in Gaza is on many people's minds. And key, as I understood from what you're saying, is we need to see stability in order to enact these longer-term plans that we have for growth, for medium-term growth, for raising the living standards. What impact are you seeing from the war and the tension in the region right now?
I think I will try to be very brief. It is very, very unfortunate to see loss of lives, wherever that is. Civilian lives are important, whether it is in Ukraine or in Palestine or elsewhere. And therefore, when you have conflicts of this nature in your region, it puts a lot of pressure in the emotions, in the mood. And it is not secret that economy is impacted by the mood. Economy is impacted by perception, by sentiment. Second, I think cool-headed countries and leaders and people need to prevail. And you need to make sure that you actually de-escalate and do everything we can. In Saudi Arabia, I can tell you, for the last several years, we made it a very clear strategic objective that we de-escalate in the region. The region needs stability. The region needs really to focus on its people and its growth and its economy rather than really focusing on politics and conflicts. But overall, I am optimistic by nature, and I will continue to be. I think we need to work hard and push our friends and work with our allies around the world to bring more stability in this region, but also beyond.
Yeah. Minister, I'm going to turn to you. One of the, I guess, big downward surprises to growth last year was the faltering growth out of China, the property downturn, specific to China, but also affected the region as well. So from your standpoint, just give us a sense of how these past 12 to 18 months have played out and the somewhat disappointing post-COVID recovery that we got out of China. What impact has that had on the region?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you to Minister Al-Jadaan for hosting us here. It's been great so far. But let me just touch a bit first on the growth that we've been talking just now. Kristalina mentioned it. I think the Minister Al-Jadaan also mentioned it. For policymakers, it's actually very difficult to strike a balance between quantity growth and quality growth, right? And for us, we need to ensure that growth is sustainable, growth is inclusive, growth is equitable, and also growth is resilient. And because all these factors will ensure there will be global prosperity and global stability, and we touched on that, right? So for the region, for Southeast Asia, if you look at Southeast Asia, it has been a net beneficiary in the last couple of years. In fact, the last 4 years, you've seen FDI doubling because of the flows. I mean, why? Perhaps it started with COVID. There was concern about supply chain resiliency, supply chain security, and then there's issue, and you just mentioned about China, the strategy of companies, strategies of industries, where there's the China Plus One, and we've seen that as well. And ASEAN being very neutral in many of its position, has been attractive for many institutions and companies to relook at strengthening their supply chain. Right? So for ASEAN, it's just to give you a perspective of ASEAN, and Malaysia, of course, is one of them. Growth has been around 4 to 5%, and is expected to continue that trend. And that is really the fastest growing bloc. We are the 5th largest economic bloc, population of 680 million people, GDP of $3.7 trillion US dollars. And we, as a member of ASEAN, also recognize the importance of the growth to be inclusive. Right? So one growth of one ASEAN nation should not be at the expense of another. And how do we do this? I mean, of course, I think IMF recently just talked about the growth in global trade. This year, trade is expected to grow stronger than last year. If I'm not mistaken, 3.3% this year. Last year was around 0.3%. In fact, the lowest in 50 years. And ASEAN, as a group of nations, look at their trade to GDP is all above 100%. I mean, Malaysia is, of course, open economy, Singapore, etc. So we are in the right position to leverage and, well, opportunistic in a way, to ensure that we ride on this. So back to the question with China, right? China is ASEAN's largest trading partner. In fact, it is Malaysia's largest trading partner for the last 15 years. Just to give you a figure, Malaysia, China, total trade with Malaysia, China is about 17% of Malaysia's total trade. It's an important part of ASEAN as well. And if we look at intra-ASEAN, which is again important because as economies within ASEAN integrate better, deepen further, that will bring stability as well. So unfortunately for ASEAN, intra-trade within ASEAN is around 22-23%. So there's room for improvement. Of course, there's a lot of multilateral agreements being signed, I think, and then ASEAN has also engaged GCC last year for the first time, and we're going to continue to engage GCC. In fact, we have a forum after this, GCC ASEAN, and again, we have seen also big flows from Europe and US. And for us, we need to ensure, because when I talk about quality and quantity just now, what we're seeing is that quantity of growth, I mentioned 4 to 5%. Malaysia last year was around 3.7%. This region is around 4 to 5%, but is that growth even, right, within the nations and within industries? So when we look as policymakers, we have our plans, but again, like Mr. Al-Jadaan said, it's all about implementation, it's about execution. So let's look at industries that around ASEAN. We need to ensure that they move to the next level. How do they do that? They need to increase the complexity, economic complexity of their industries, economic complexity of their economy, which will then lead to increase in wages, increase in household income, and therefore, in a way, will bring much more stability as well. Right? So, because sometimes your GDP is 4 to 5%, but then when you look at, we go down on the ground, without any policymaker intervention, there will be uneven growth across countries and across sectors. So we need to settle that one. The other one, I think you mentioned about technology innovation, that's going to be key for the region as well, because to ensure that, from a perspective of Minister of Trade, not only physical infrastructure is important, but also digital infrastructure. Again, some countries are in a stronger fiscal position, and as you mentioned, we were also affected by COVID, given the fiscal space at that time was utilized quite fully, in fact, by some nations. You see the debt to GDP of many countries has gone up quite considerably, but growth is going to be key to alleviate, to mitigate that impact. So to me, we need to ensure the economies continue to grow, that the growth definitely must be more even, sustainable, and finally, like it or not, the region also needs to ensure that to achieve sustainability, you need to also embrace the green economy. So this is where ASEAN, again, are investing a lot in this, and with China and with Europe, with US, I mean, if you look at China and US, it's already, nearly half of the world's GDP, right? Yep. So ASEAN will have to work closely with both powers, and of course, Europe and the other rest of the world as well.
Right. Yep. Thank you. Well, I think you may have slipped in the term geoeconomic fragmentation, or maybe it's just imprinted on my mind because I've attended many of these IMF meetings, but I am going to go there. I know you've done a lot of work on it. Gita also has spoken about it a lot. But there is one of the themes that has emerged in the last couple of years is there is a tendency now for economies to become more protectionist. There's a feeling that, you know, at a state level, you want to bolster the national economy at the expense potentially of trade with some of your close allies. And, you know, you see it in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, you see it in China with the push for the transition. The state is playing an ever increasingly large role in terms of driving economic activity. And I just wonder, if you look about it again through the lens of growth, because that's what our panel is about, whether ultimately this is a good thing. Is this going to lead to the growth outcomes that we would like to see?
When we look at the trajectory as of now, it is a rather depressing story. Medium-term growth is weak by historic standards. I compare this trajectory to a ski slope. So we expect, if the previous decade average growth was 3.8%, we expect this decade growth to be around 3%, much lower than before. Why is this happening? It is happening for two broad reasons. One is not enough productivity to lift up growth. In fact, we did some analysis. It says half of this slowdown in productivity is causing, productivity is half of the reason why we have this slowdown of growth in advanced economies and big emerging market economies. Almost all of the slowdown in low-income countries. Investing in people, investing in innovation, this is a must if we want to see productivity coming up. The second reason is geoeconomic fragmentation. Our analysis shows that if we bring the power of trade and access to finance in a more open and inclusive manner, by the end of the decade, global growth can go up by 1.2%. In other words, all this growth lost from the previous decade can come back. Would it happen? It depends very much on the way in which we approach the question of security of supplies that is genuinely one policymakers are wrestling with. COVID and the war in Ukraine told us that relying on single source for your supplies is potentially catastrophic, that diversifying the supply chains is a must, that some redundancy in supply chains is a necessity. The question is, are we going to do what is necessary and not more, or we would go further? And at this point, the indications are troubling. We have seen over the last years trade restrictions quadrupling. And when we analyze industrial policy measures, 2,500 of those have been taken over the last years. 17% of them are trade disrupting, negative for trade measures. So we have industrial policy that may be justified because you want to accelerate decarbonization. That was the logic behind some of the measures today, yes. But are you doing it wisely? And the jury is not out. The jury has pronounced itself. We're going too far in that direction. So what do we do at the IMF? What we are doing is we are providing the analytical underpinning for decisions that would strengthen supply chains, that would bring some of the benefits of industrial policy. Let's remember, industrial policy is justified when there are market failures, and the state steps forward to correct them. But please don't do more than it is necessary. Why? Because then what we end up with is misallocation of resources, of capital and labor. And when that happens, guess what? We're poorer. So I appeal to rational decision-making that recognizes no more we can bring that notion of just in time as the only one. No more we can look only at cost considerations when we design supply chains, but don't go overboard. Don't throw this beautiful trade baby with the bath water.
Mana, may I comment? I think this is actually very critical. Two things actually to note. One is there is a very heavy price for fragmentation that is going to be paid by everybody around the world, which is inflation. Fragmentation means redundancy, means
higher
inefficiency, which means higher cost. So it's not about competitiveness and who's the cheapest will be provided to the world, but rather really through protectionism, you will get actually more expensive, more inefficient industries being protected, which means really inflation. Yeah. And then you get into this vicious cycle. The second is, obviously we need, as Kristalina said, we need to de-risk, the supply chain, but then there is a big difference between de-risking supply chain and then using it as a geopolitical tool, really, to hurt your opponents. I've said in the previous WEF meeting, and I think in our IMF Marrakesh meeting, that I was, and I have continued to be optimist. I think people are feeling, countries are feeling the pain of actually fragmentation. I hope wisdom would prevail and they will correct course, because unfortunately what we are seeing even until today, as we speak, more negative actions being taken that are really not economically driven to de-risk, but rather driven by politics.
I want to ask you a Saudi-specific question, because we're here, we talk about the Saudi 2030 vision, and of course that's a very good example of a medium-term growth plan. And a big part of that, the pillar, is bolstering the non-oil economy. And if you look at the numbers last year, of course, Saudi Arabia went through a challenging year economically, but the non-oil sector was the outperformer versus the oil sector. Have you had to reassess the medium-term plans because of the factors that we were talking about earlier? And you said, there's no ego with your planning. When the facts change, you obviously have to change your plans as well. Have you had to, say, mark to market your expectations of what you can achieve with the Saudi 2030 vision?
The short answer is absolutely yes. But let me just clarify two things that are very important. Vision 2030 is about actually the non-oil GDP. And to the point of His Excellency about quality and quantity, Saudi Arabia is able, and was able last year, to make the growth 10% GDP. Literally. And I'm not exaggerating, okay? We produce 9 million barrels a day of oil last year. We could have actually put the accelerator on and produce 10. That will give us about 8% GDP growth. And we could have even accelerated more and produced 11. And that will give us 15% GDP growth. And if we wanted to accelerate more, we have the capacity to produce 12.
12, that's the maximum.
And that will give us 25%. And I can make this year-on-year 10% for the next 5 years. But this is not a quality growth. This is quantity growth. Okay? What is important for us is the non-oil GDP. The non-oil GDP has actually, even last year, when we saw our GDP, total GDP, almost flat, almost zero, actually non-oil GDP grew at 4.4%, which is very healthy compared to the world. So that is really the focus. Vision 2030 about empowering private sector, which is a point I missed on the first point you asked. Private sector enablement is key in any plans that you put forward. The government role is to be out of business. The government role is to make policies to enable the private sector, but not to actually do the business. It's the private sector business. And if you are able to do the right policy structure, you will enable the private sector. You will actually have sustainable, more inclusive growth. That's what Vision 2030 about. And I can tell you halfway now, we are actually very pleased. We are not complacent, but we are very pleased with what was achieved. And I think the report was, the half journey report was announced yesterday or the day before, where actually 87% of the targets are on track. A lot of targets have been over-delivered. There are challenges, obviously, and this is why I said we don't have ego. We will change course, we will adjust, we will extend some of the projects, we will downscale some of the projects, we will accelerate other projects.
Well, we don't want you out of business, because then I won't be able to talk to you.
He will be then doing the business of government.
Exactly.
Facilitate private sector's growth.
Absolutely.
Can I expand a bit about what Kristalina said about trade? Because I was at in Abu Dhabi, the MC30, the WTO meeting. Many talked about this year will be slightly better, more optimistic about things. But at the same time, there is concern about, yes, geopolitics is definitely an issue being used as, technology security, etc. But also about non-tariff barriers under the name, under the pretext of sustainability. There will be socio-economic impact if that transition towards sustainability using trade parameters, where, for example, a country that may not be ready to meet the conditions of sustainability through capacity issues, not just monetary issues, but you need capacity building at the same time, then you will see that that growth that we're talking about today will not be an inclusive one. So I think when, for Malaysia, we have 14 bilateral and multilateral FTAs. So we are, in many of those discussions, and we are seeing that sometimes we need to be very careful. You talk about, yes, supply chain resiliency, supply chain security, and therefore you have in fact, sometimes very explicitly trade barriers, but the non-trade barriers also increasing, right? And this will affect the quality of growth that we want to see, because we are seeing more and more countries, especially developing countries and LDCs as well, are finding it difficult to meet those standards, and it will have an impact to them. I'm not saying that they shouldn't aspire to meet, but I think the transition to meet that standards has to be done equitably. And you need, again, the more developed nations to be also participating in this. Yeah.
I've got a couple of minutes before.
Yeah, just one addition to that point. It is a slippery slope. Once a measure is taken by one country, history says 75% probability, reciprocity from other countries. So where do we end? In a very bad place.
Final question that I'm going to put to both of you, because I know this is a subject close to your heart. What is the type of cooperation we need to see between richer countries and lower income developing countries?
Fair. And that means poor countries also have to do their part. They need to collect taxes, they need to fight corruption, they need to improve the quality of spending, they need to demonstrate that they are committed to their own people. And the response must be that they get a huge deal of international support in that restructuring, in helping them to meet their financial needs with support from outside. It is genuinely the moment to recognize that we are in this small boat called world together. And we cannot say, the rich countries cannot say to the poor, oh, you know what, your side of the boat is leaking. We would all sink.
Well said, Kristalina. I would not have said it better. I think a few things. One is, there is a promising, I can tell you, there is actually a promising trajectory in empowering multilateral development institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. And what is even more interesting and helpful is there is a significantly better coordination and cooperation between them. And I've seen it firsthand recently, where they actually almost have a task force collectively to help individual countries that are in need. And I've said this before, and I will repeat it again. Without an extensive reform, without countries who are recipients of the support doing their part, as Kristalina said, I think we will just be putting good money after bad. So we need to make sure that we encourage them, not only with providing financial support, but also technical support, and making sure that we develop their own people to actually do the right thing. Second, I think this is very important. We should avoid forcing them to make a choice between, two countries or two groups of countries. I think it is very difficult to go to Africa and say, listen, if you want us to help you, you need to stop dealing with China. Or if you want us to help you, you need to stop dealing with the G7 or the US. That is not a fair choice to put before them, because they need all the help they can, whether it is from the south or from north. And I think we are seeing actually a better way of approaching this now, although I think we can look for more.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to leave it. We've gone through a lot already on this panel about the now, the future, geoeconomic fragmentation, some of the barriers that are going up. I think we all agree that too many barriers is not a good thing, could be inflationary, and the importance of cooperation. I started off this panel by saying that we're going to end with a couple of minutes from Sadia Zahidi, who's the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, to talk us through the initiative, the Future of Growth initiative. But before we do that, I just want to thank the panelists so much. I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you, Managing Director, Your Excellencies. Really appreciate it. Sadia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jumana, and thank you so much to all the panelists for this very rich discussion, and really the right one to get us started for the next 2 days of conversation here in Riyadh. We kicked off in Davos, the Future of Growth Initiative. It's a 2-year set of work, and there are 3 ways that we invite you to get involved. One is the data that is helping provide a dashboard for countries to look at both quantity and quality measures. You can download that here in this room and continue to stay involved in that conversation. No data is perfect, but we're trying to get that conversation started. The second way is the global conversation around what should be the right framework for looking at quantity and quality growth. Please join the Growth Consortium. Please join the dialogues on that. That will continue over the course of the next 2 years at every activity that the World Economic Forum will be holding. And then the third way is country-level dialogues, because there is an element of that that has to be customized, and we will be kicking off with at least 5 countries this year, country-specific dialogues, and more to come over the course of the next year. So thank you again to all the panelists for the conversation, and please join this 2-year initiative.
Thank you.
If we can go.
Thank you. I think we need to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
After.